Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a really fascinating aspect of autism. It's emotional permanence. And to help us unpack all this, we've got a collection of articles and blog posts from Cheap ABA. Now you might be thinking, emotions, that sounds pretty heavy. But trust me, stick with us because this is something that can really shift your perspective on how we experience the world, whether we're on the autism spectrum or not.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting about this idea of emotional permanence? This knowing that feelings are temporary. It's something that many of us just develop without even realizing it.
It's like knowing that even though we might have a thunderstorm right now, the sun will eventually come back out.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy. But for some autistic individuals, it can be more challenging to grasp this kind of ebb and flow of emotions. The Cheap ABA blog points out that they might experience these emotions more intensely, and they can even last for longer durations.
So then the question is like, why is that? What's going on in the brain that might make those feelings feel so much stronger for some people than others?
Well, the research suggests that there could be differences in the neural pathways that are related to emotional processing. For example, some studies have indicated that the amygdala, that's the part of the brain that's associated with processing emotions,
Hmm.
that it might be more reactive in some autistic individuals.
So it's not just like a matter of willpower or like choosing to feel differently. It sounds like there could be actual biological differences at play here.
Exactly. And as heightened sensitivity, it can make it really tough to see those feelings as temporary, like those passing storms you were talking about. It's more like the storm clouds, they kind of linger for a lot longer. And this is where the concept of emotional regulation comes in. And this is something that's also discussed extensively in that Cheap ABA blog.
Yeah, they make a great point about it being like a car without good brakes. Like you might feel like you're constantly on edge or struggling to control the intensity of your experience.
Precisely. But it's important to highlight that this doesn't mean that autistic individuals can't learn to regulate their emotions. It just means that they might need different strategies and support to do so.
Okay, so let's dive into those strategies a little bit. The Cheap ABA blog really emphasizes the importance of supporting authentic emotions. But before we go any further, can we maybe define what that actually means in this context?
Sure, so authentic emotions in this sense.
Yeah.
It means recognizing and accepting all feelings without judgment. It's about acknowledging that emotions, even the difficult ones, are a natural part of being human.
So it's not about trying to force someone to feel happy all the time. It's about creating a space where they can safely express that full range of emotions.
Absolutely. And this is where those practical strategies come in. One that really stood out to me was this idea of emotional labeling. The blog explained how it's like putting name tags on feelings.
That's such a great visual. It's like instead of just feeling overwhelmed by this storm of emotions, you can start to identify those individual clouds: anger, sadness, frustration, and understand them better.
Exactly. And by being able to name those feelings, you can start to gain a sense of control over them. And then there's emotional validation, which is equally as crucial.
And this is where we go beyond just labeling the emotion. We're actually acknowledging that the person's feelings are valid.
Precisely. It's about saying, I see that you're feeling emotion, and that's okay. It's not about dismissing or minimizing their experience, but rather letting them know that their feelings are real and understandable.
This makes me think about like the experience of stubbing your toe. Like it hurts. And even though it might seem small to someone else, it's important to acknowledge that pain instead of just telling the person to get over it.
That's a fantastic analogy.
Yeah.
Because emotional pain, just like physical pain, it deserves to be acknowledged and validated.
So we've talked about identifying and validating emotions, but what about actually helping someone manage those really intense feelings? Especially when it feels like the brakes aren't working so well.
That's where emotional regulation strategies come into play. The Cheap ABA blog suggests a whole range of techniques that can help individuals navigate those strong emotions. I think it would be helpful to break them down into a few categories. First, we have what are called cognitive strategies, and these involve changing your thought patterns. So, for example, if someone's feeling anxious about a social situation, they might try using a technique called cognitive reframing to challenge those negative thoughts and try to replace them with more balanced ones.
So instead of thinking everyone's going to judge me, they might reframe it as maybe some people will be friendly and I can focus on connecting with them.
Exactly. It's about shifting your perspective to manage those anxious feelings. Then we have sensory strategies, and these involve using sensory input to kind of regulate emotions.
This makes me think about how some people find comfort in things like weighted blankets or maybe listening to calming music.
Yeah, that's a great example. Those sensory experiences can provide a sense of grounding and help to reduce those overwhelming feelings. And lastly, we have behavioral strategies, which involve taking action to change your emotional state.
So that could be something like going for a run to release some pent-up energy, or maybe engaging in a relaxing hobby to de-stress.
Precisely. It's about finding healthy outlets for those intense emotions. Now, another strategy that the Cheap ABA blog highlights is the use of social stories to illustrate how emotions can change over time. And I find this particularly fascinating because it taps into the way many autistic individuals process information.
Speaking of social stories, I remember reading that they can be especially effective for autistic individuals because they often thrive on routine and predictability. So a social story can provide a kind of roadmap for understanding how emotions might shift in different situations.
That's an excellent point, and that simple, straightforward nature of social stories can make them very accessible, especially for individuals who might find abstract concepts or complex language challenging.
To give our listener a really concrete example, could you walk us through what a social story about emotional permanence might look like?
Absolutely. Let's imagine a child who's incredibly excited about going to the park, but then it starts to rain and they can't go. The social story might begin with a picture of the child beaming with joy and a caption that says, "Right now, a child's name feels very happy because they're going to the park." Then we might see a picture of the rain clouds gathering, and the caption could read, "Child's name feels disappointed because it's raining and they can't go to the park."
This is where we can start to show that shift in emotions, right?
Exactly. The next picture might show the child engaged in a different activity at home, maybe reading a book or playing a game, with the caption, "Child's name is starting to feel better. They're enjoying their new activity, and they know they can go to the park another day."
I love how that simple story illustrates that disappointment just like any other emotion. It isn't a permanent state. It's like those rain clouds, they eventually move on and the sun peeks back out.
And that's a key takeaway for our listeners. Understanding this concept of emotional permanence. It isn't just about supporting autistic individuals. It's about broadening our own understanding of how emotions work for everybody.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit more. Why is this concept so crucial? Especially in terms of fostering empathy and understanding.
Well, we can start to see the world through this lens of emotional permanence. We can approach our interactions with more patience and compassion. We can recognize that someone's outburst or withdrawal might not be intentional, but rather a reflection of their struggle to regulate intense emotions.
This makes me think about how often we judge people's reactions without really understanding what's going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. We might label someone as overreacting or being dramatic without even considering that they might be experiencing those emotions on a completely different level. And this lack of understanding can lead to miscommunication, conflict, and even strained relationships.
So then how can we use this knowledge to become better allies and supporters, not just for autistic individuals, but for everyone in our lives?
Well, I think active listening is a big part of it, really tuning into what someone is saying
Mm.
and trying to understand their perspective, even if it's different from our own.
It's like saying, I hear you. I see your pain, your joy, your frustration, and I'm here for you, whatever that looks like.
Exactly. It's about offering support and validation rather than trying to control or change someone's emotional experience. And I think this is where the Cheap ABA blog's emphasis on supporting authentic emotions really shines. It encourages us to move away from this idea that there are good emotions and bad emotions, and instead embrace the full spectrum of human experience.
This whole conversation is making me rethink how I approach emotions, both my own and those of others. It's like you said earlier. This concept of emotional permanence, it applies to everyone, not just those on the autism spectrum.
It's such an important point. We all experience those emotional ups and downs, those moments of intense joy, frustration, sadness, excitement. And learning to navigate those fluctuations in a healthy way, well, it's a lifelong journey for all of us.
This brings us back to that powerful weather analogy. If emotions are like the weather constantly shifting and changing, how can we all get better at forecasting those changes, both in ourselves and in others?
I love that question. And I think it starts with self-awareness, paying attention to our own emotional patterns. You know, those triggers that tend to set off those storms, those calming influences that bring back the sunshine.
So it's like becoming our own personal meteorologist, learning to recognize the signs of an approaching emotional storm, and figuring out what tools we need to weather it.
Precisely. And just like a good weather forecast can help us decide whether to pack an umbrella or sunscreen, understanding our own emotional patterns can help equip us to navigate challenges more effectively. If you know you tend to get irritable when you're hungry, for example, well, maybe make sure you have a snack handy to avoid a meltdown later on.
That's such a practical and relatable example. It really brings this whole concept down to earth.
And the beauty of it is that it's a skill that can be developed over time. Just like we learn to read the weather forecasts, we can learn to read our own internal forecasts and those of the people around us. And the more we practice, the better we get at it.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like we've just peeled back layers of understanding about emotions, autism, and the human experience as a whole.
I completely agree. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listener feels empowered to approach their own emotional landscape and those of others with more empathy, awareness, and compassion.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into autism and emotional permanence. We hope you found this conversation as thought-provoking as we have. And remember, just like the weather, emotions can be unpredictable, but with a little understanding and a good emotional forecast, we can all learn to weather those storms together. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and sometimes that might mean just acknowledging someone's feelings without trying to fix them or offer advice that they didn't ask for.
Right, it's more about just being present with them, not necessarily trying to solve the problem.
It's about providing that support and validation
Yeah.
rather than trying to control or change their experience. And I think this is where the cheap ABA blog's emphasis on supporting authentic emotions really shines. It encourages us to move away from this whole idea that there are good emotions and bad emotions, and instead just embrace the full spectrum of human experience.
Yeah, this whole conversation is making me rethink how I approach emotions, both my own and those of others. Because like you said earlier, this concept of emotional permanence, it really does apply to everyone, not just those on the autism spectrum.
Absolutely. We all experience those ups and downs, those
Mhm.
moments of, you know, intense joy, frustration,
Yes.
sadness, excitement, and learning to navigate those fluctuations in a healthy way. Well, that's a lifelong journey for all of us.
This brings us back to that weather analogy. If emotions are like the weather, constantly shifting and changing, how can we get better at forecasting those changes, both in ourselves and in others?
Hmm. That's such a great question. I think it starts with self-awareness, paying attention to our own emotional patterns. What are those triggers that tend to set off those storms for us? What are those calming influences that bring back the sunshine?
So it's almost like we have to become our own personal meteorologists, learning to recognize the signs of an approaching emotional storm
Mm.
and figuring out what tools we need to weather it.
Exactly. Just like a good weather forecast can help us decide, you know, whether to pack an umbrella or sunscreen, understanding our own emotional patterns can equip us to navigate challenges more effectively. Like, for example, if you know you tend to get irritable when you're hungry, well, maybe you make sure you have a snack handy to avoid a meltdown later on.
Right. It's like if you know a storm's coming, you prepare for it.
Exactly.
That's such a practical example. It really brings this whole concept down to earth.
And the beauty is, it's a skill that can be developed. Just like we learn to read the weather forecasts, we can learn to read our own internal forecasts and those of the people around us. The more we practice, the better we get at it.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. I feel like we really peeled back the layers of understanding about emotions, autism, and just the human experience as a whole.
I completely agree. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope our listener feels empowered to approach their own emotional landscape and those of others with more empathy, awareness, and compassion.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into autism and emotional permanence. We hope you found this conversation as insightful as we have. And remember, just like the weather, emotions can be unpredictable. But with a little understanding and a good emotional forecast, we can all learn to weather those storms together. Thanks for joining us.